slide.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Let me know when it's full screen.
Yeah.
I'll mute myself.
Yes. Now it's full screen. Good morning, everybody, and warmly welcome to this NIVA webinar on improving non-technical safety skills among workers in construction, given by Professor Karina Nielsen and Dr. Kara Ng. I am Cecilia Weckman from NIVA, and I will be moderating this webinar today. NIVA's role is to be a facilitator in occupational health and safety related discussions in the Nordics. And as the COVID-19 situation has made it impossible to meet in NIVA courses, we are doing our best to keep the discussion going through webinars. We're happy to see that so many of you have chosen to join us today. First, some practical things. Your camera and microphone will be turned off the whole time. Please feel free to use the chat function for comments and questions. You can access the chat by pressing the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar when we will answer your questions. The webinar will also be recorded, but no participant names will be visible. Recording can be viewed later on our website. And then a few words about today's speakers. Karina Nielsen is Professor of Work Psychology and Director of the Institute of Work Psychology at the University of Sheffield. She has more than 20 years of experience developing and evaluating interventions targeting individuals, groups, leaders, and changing work practices and procedures. Dr. Kara Ng is a Presidential Fellow in Organizational Psychology at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. She has previously worked on the ESTEEM project at the Institute of Work Psychology. She is interested in employee well-being and understanding why people do bad things, such as bullying or mobbing. Welcome, Kara and Karina. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and thank you very much for organizing this. I have done several NIVA courses in the past, and I'm always advocating them because it's such a pleasure working with the NIVA people. They're always so helpful and efficient in setting up these things. And Cecilia has been incredibly efficient and helpful setting up this webinar as well. So thank you very much, Cecilia. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. Unfortunately, we can't meet in person. So what we're going to talk about today is a newly, well, it's not quite finished yet because we had it extended due to COVID-19, so it ends at the end of the year, but it's a project that's coming to an end. We've called it the ESTEEM project, and it's about facilitating mobility of construction workers across Europe. And we are focusing on how can we create good safety behaviors amongst construction workers, and in particular migrant workers. And why we're focusing on migrant workers, I'll tell you in a second. But it has been funded by Erasmus+, by the European Union, while we still can engage in that in the UK. So what we'll be talking about is give you some safety statistics first, talk about why migrant construction workers are particularly vulnerable, the aims of the project. Kara will present some of the key outputs from the project, and then I'll talk a bit about what we have learned so far and what we think are the key learnings from the project, the key strengths of the project, and I'll present to you the the online output that we have developed. So we know that work-related accidents and illnesses are a huge problem. So ILO have figures that say that every 15 seconds, 150 workers have a work-related accident, and every 15 seconds, one worker dies from a work-related accident or illness, which is scarily high, despite the focus we've had for many, many, many years now. The construction sector is a particularly vulnerable or at-risk sector. So 21% of fatal accidents at work in the European countries happen in construction, and both in the US and the UK, there are a lot of fatalities in the construction industry. Migrant workers are a particularly vulnerable group in construction. What often happens is that when males go to work in another country, their first job is in construction because that's where it's easy to get a job, and that doesn't really matter whether they've worked in construction before or not. So we have the challenges of migrant workers, migrant maids coming to a new country. They're not necessarily familiar with the safety laws and regulations, the cultures, the norms, and in addition to that, they're not necessarily accustomed to the construction work either, which puts them particularly at risk. In the UK, there are a lot of migrant workers in construction, and they are also at risk of dying in construction. So there are quite a few accidents that are from migrant workers. So why do we think migrant workers, or why do we know by now from the literature that migrant workers are vulnerable? So there are several issues that can help explain why that is the case. First of all, there are language barriers. They find it difficult to understand, or can find it difficult to understand safety information, instructions. Even if there is compulsory training, they may not understand what the training is about. They are not familiar with the safety rules and the regulations of the host country. They may be poorly integrated into the workplace. So what the research has shown is that migrant workers quite often work in their own teams. They don't necessarily interact with native peers, which means that they don't learn the safety norms and regulations. And further to that, there can also be cultural differences. They can perhaps come from countries where there's more of a macho culture towards safety, and therefore they have different values and attitudes compared to native workers. And of course, language is one of the key barriers to learning. Other aspects are also the labor market conditions. So sometimes migrant workers are in the country illegally, and that means they don't have access, they don't have the same rights, they don't have access to the same training. They may not have had training before they enter the country. As I said before, many of them may not have worked in construction before. They have poor working conditions. We often find that migrant workers take on the most risky, the most dangerous jobs. They experience increased pressure to prioritize safety over performance. They sometimes have poor relationships with the supervisors, and they don't necessarily have access to safety equipment. In addition to the conditions in the workplace, there are also issues around, sometimes they come and they live in caravans, they live in flats, a lot of them live together, there's a lack of hygiene, they don't get an opportunity to sleep, and they don't necessarily eat healthily either. So there are issues not only in the workplace, but also them coming into the workplace being tired and fatigued because of their living conditions. So basically what we wanted to do is try to, how can we improve safety in the construction industry, focusing in particular on migrant workers. So some of the key aims that we established was, how do injuries, accidents and incidents typically arise in the construction sites across Europe, particularly for low skill and migrant workers? What kind of training can we develop that may help reduce these injuries, accidents and incidents, in particular focusing on low skilled and migrant workers? And we also wanted to look at how has these training interventions been evaluated, and how can we provide a really good training package that gives it good insights in whether the training works, but also whether learning from training is being translated into actual safe behaviors in the workplace, training transfer. So who we are, this was a collaboration between the University of Sheffield, the University of Valencia in Spain, and the University of Bologna in Italy. We have also worked with the Construction Industry Training Board in the UK, the HSE, and IOT, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, is the Labour Inspectorate in the UK, and the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health is a worldwide professional body that are looking at safety and health at work. They are based in the UK. And then our Italian and Spanish partners had training partners, Valora Prevención in Spain and IPLA in Italy. We didn't have a training partner in the UK, and you will see in a minute that that has had quite a severe impact on what we were able to do in the UK. So the 6 key outputs from the ESTEEM project are, first of all, we've developed a safety training knowledge base. So I'll come into that in detail, what we did, but that was basically trying to understand what are the issues around safety training of migrant workers, what is current state of the art. Then we have developed an interactive platform for safety training, and that's basically EU language for online materials. I'll also show you the different materials we have developed. Then we developed a safety training package that we have piloted and we have tested. We developed an evaluation device, an evaluation framework, where we used mixed methods to understand whether it worked or not, and also what made it work. We also developed a certification system, both for trainers who are delivering the training and for trainees. And then we've developed a safety training guideline. So basically my presentation is going into each of these and then tell you about what we've done and what the outputs are for each of these. So in terms of the knowledge base, what we first did was that we conducted a systematic literature review, the scientific literature related to safety training of low-skilled migrant construction workers. Out of 2,681 papers, we identified 18, only 18 that focused explicitly on construction and on migrant workers and safety training. And none of those were from Europe. Many of them were from the US, from Australia, from Asian countries, but none of them were conducted in Europe. We also conducted an analysis of existing safety training provision, courses, methods, activities that were available online, their effectiveness, an overview of the safety laws and regulations in the UK with a particular focus on also with the UK, Spain and Italy, information about safety accident statistics and health and safety professional bodies. We identified a total of 416 sources, which can all be found on our website. We also conducted interviews and focus groups with migrant workers, with native workers, site supervisors, trainers, and OSH practitioners to get an overview of what kind of training are they providing now, are they getting now if they're migrant workers or workers, and what kind of training do they feel is needed to get a better understanding of state of the art. And we did that in both Italy, Spain, and the UK. So some of the things that we learned from analyzing all this data is that there's a need to design appropriate and effective training for low-skilled migrant workers, taking into account the language barriers, the cultural difference, the adverse labor market conditions. So what we tried to do was to develop a training course that focused on a lot of visual material, a lot of interaction, and also because we wanted to break down the barriers of migrant workers working on their own and native workers working on their own, try to facilitate that this is a shared responsibility. There were a lot of practical exercises where trainees could interact and share their experiences with working safely in the workplace. And we decided to open up the training for both migrant workers and native workers to kind of hopefully create a climate that would be transferred to the construction side. What we also found that a lot of the training focuses on technical skills, so use of PPE, technical skills, mechanical skills, chemicals, hazards, all those kind of things. But I'm hoping people can hear me. I am getting, it looks like I've got problems with Zoom.
Okay, you are back now. We can hear you and see you.
Yeah. I shall continue then, and give me a shout if I break out or something like that. But we identified 5 soft skills. So first of
Karina, your screen's not shared anymore.
Oh, thank you. That's interesting. Any better?
Yes. Yes.
Brilliant.
Good.
Thank you, because I thought I was sharing my screen all along. So well done, Kara. So the 5 technical skills that we are, non-technical skills or soft skills we are focusing on is communication. So how can you communicate about safety in the workplace, teamwork, that it's a shared responsibility to ensure a good safety environment and safe behaviors, situational awareness, so identifying risks, being aware, monitoring the situation, what kind of risk am I facing, making decisions about the risks, so how can I address them, how can I minimize these risks, and then finally fatigue and stress management. When I come into work, how do we deal with people who are stressed out, who are fatigued? We also found from the literature and from our interviews that there's a need to find better ways of evaluating training effectiveness. And here we focus in particular of training transfer. So what happens with the learning that you acquire during the training? Does that actually translate into good safety behaviors back in the workplace? Because that's of course what we are aiming for. Okay, I am trying to change my slide, but it's not working. I'm just gonna. I do apologize. It was working when we tested it. Here we go. So moving on to the second output from the project, the online platform for safety training. We've got 3 different online platforms. So first of all, we have got the ESTEEM website, which is the main website. I'll tell you about that towards the end of the presentation. I'll give you the content of that, or explain the content of that, but that's basically the one that explains the project and has got links to everything else. Then we've got the online training platform. So we've got the contents of the training online as well. I'll tell you more about the training in a second. And then we've got the guidelines that we developed. All of this material has been translated into Italian, Spanish, and English. So moving on to our third output, our training package. So based on the review that we did, we developed a training package that consists of 5 sessions, or 5 walls that are each 4 hours. The second one you can see is white, and that's because that's only for Spain and Italy, because in the UK we have got mandatory training that's being done by the CITB, the Construction Industry Training Board. So we didn't include that material in the UK training. So in the first wall, we start off with an entrance test, an introduction to the project and to the training, explaining how to use the platform. It contains face-to-face learning, those are our walls, and then there's also an e-learning wall with training and material and gaming on the online platform. So how to use the online platform, what the difference is between technical and non-technical skills, and what are we focusing on in this training. Then the second wall is mandatory safety training in Spain and Italy. And then the third wall is technical contents taught alongside non-technical skills. So when we're teaching the technical content, we are also focusing on how can you monitor the situation, how can you make decisions about these technical skills that you're learning. And we did that in the 4th learning wall as well, and in the 5th. And then we have the exit test at the end, a knowledge test that tests whether you have acquired the technical skills that we were hoping you would acquire. And as I said, there's an e-learning wall. So there's basically 4 hours worth of material available on an online platform that contains games and stuff like that. And it's basically linked to each of the wall. So if you find that you're struggling with a particular content, for example, in wall 3, then you can go in and find some additional material to help you develop your skills in that area. A bit more information is if we take like learning wall 3 or session 3 as an example, the technical contents were mechanical skills, electrical skills, chemical skills, and physical hazards. And then non-technical skills supporting good safety behaviors in those areas were communication, situational awareness, and decision making. So when you identify a electrical hazard, how do you communicate about it, and how do you make decisions about to minimize that hazard, to minimize the risk? The classroom activities were an analysis of videos, of pictures, of news articles, group exercises and discussions where workers could apply their existing knowledge and give examples of how they dealt with these situations in the past and what they would do in the current situation. Hazard identification, risk reduction, and good safety practices, discussions of that. The online activities were falling from heights, risk of electrocution, chemical hazards, and safety sequences. So what do you do in which sequence to ensure good safety behaviors? An example of a video, I won't show it, but it's essentially a video showing a group of migrant workers engaging in unsafe behaviors where it goes terribly wrong. And then workers in the training can analyze what were the decisions that were made by the workers in the video, what should they have done instead, and what were the problems. This is what the online platform looks like. So there's an introduction of what are we talking about today, what are the objectives, what are we trying to achieve, what is the content, and then there's also the additional online material that workers can engage with. So for learning wall 3, there are 6 games where they can go in and have a go at what happens. And just to show one of these games is, for example, this one, where you have the option between choosing 2 pictures and you choose which one is the correct behavior in this case, and you drag that into the white triangle in the middle, and then you can check the answer. And if the answer is correct, in this case it was picture B, then it says yes, it was correct. And if you got the wrong picture, or you chose the wrong picture, then it will explain to you why it was wrong. So there's learning incorporated into the games. So that's all very well. We developed a pilot. We piloted in Spain and Italy. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it in the UK because we didn't have a training partner. So we needed to identify another training partner during the project, and we had done that, and we started identifying trainees to be trained. Then COVID-19 happened, and of course, focus went somewhere else. So unfortunately, we haven't piloted the training in the UK. But of course, an important part is to evaluate the pilot, finding out what were the good aspects of it, what were the bad aspects of it, but also evaluating, did it actually have an impact? So that's what we're going to do in a second. I'll hand over to Karina in a second. But basically, this is the evaluation framework that we developed. So we had the entrance test. We used that to input to the training, so the trainers had a good idea of what the basis of the knowledge was for workers that were in training. But we also, of course, used it for scientific purposes. We had a survey serving safety compliance, safety productivity, the non-technical skills, different aspects of training transfer. And then we had observations for each learning wall. And after each learning wall, we also had interviews with trainers. But what exercises did they think worked well, which didn't work so well, which required more instructions for trainers in order for them to use them in the best way. And for the observers, we basically asked them to look at, how were trainers delivering the material, how well were workers on the training engaging with the material, how were trainers and trainees engaging with each other. So that's what we did throughout the training. In the fourth learning wall, we also had action plans where they would decide, okay, so I'm going to try out these safety behaviors between now and the last learning session or training session. And then in the last training session, they discussed the action plans, what had gone well, what hasn't gone so well, trying to facilitate learning and using these skills in the workplace. Then 3 months post training completion, we sent out a third survey to the workers about what they had used, whether they were using their non-technical skills. We also had phone interviews with supervisors, asking them about what kind of behaviors they had engaged in to support the workers transferring learning. And then 6 months post-training, we also had a fourth survey asking about whether they still used these behaviors and the skills and knowledge that they had learned. And then also we had phone interviews with workers digging more into their experiences. So I think now is the time to hand over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Karina. So I'm going to be talking, as Karina mentioned earlier, a bit about the makeup of the pilot studies and then the results from our evaluation. So just first a bit about the people who were taking part in the training. So we had 3 groups in the Italian sample, and we had 4 groups in the Spanish sample. So as you can see in the pilot number column, most of the groups, all groups except one, consisted of working adults in the construction sector. But in the second Italian group, it was just a group of students who were applying for vocational certification. So that may have affected some of the results in terms of how old, the average age, the average amount of experience that all workers had. And as you can see on the 2 columns on the right, there's generally an even overall split of migrant workers versus native workers, although some groups had maybe 100% of one type of worker over the other, but overall it was quite equal. So in Italy, migrant workers tended to come from, I think, Romania, Moldova, and some North African countries. And in Spain, workers tended to come from also Romania and some South American countries. So you had a mix of what languages and EU membership and things like that. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is the framework that we used for evaluating the effectiveness of the training. So we adopted a framework known as Kirkpatrick's training evaluation model, which is one of the most popular models to evaluate interventions in research. It consists of, as you can see on the pyramid, 4 main kind of areas for evaluation. So at the bottom, you have the most kind of fundamental and most immediate evaluation target is the reaction. So whether or not people like the training, how they felt after it, because you're obviously more likely to learn if you like the training program. Then we have actual learned knowledge. So whether or not they learned any sort of more knowledge-based skills. And then on the third kind of section, we want to see if this learning within the mind transfers into actual behaviors. And then hopefully once these behaviors become more common within the workplace, they lead to more tangible results. So that's the top of the pyramid. It's more difficult to measure, but it is the most important thing that we want to target in training. So as you can see, we use different methods to measure the different forms of training evaluation. And we also decided to address 2 gaps within the Kirkpatrick model. We wanted to look at whether or not there was transfer, so the step between learning and behaviors. So we looked at whether or not some of the training needed to be adapted to workplaces. And we also wanted to look at the context in which transfer occurs. So whether or not peers and supervisors were supportive of the training and allowed opportunities for behaviors to occur. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next few slides is I'm going to talk about the results of each kind of section in the Kirkpatrick model and discuss the qualitative results, so interviews, and quantitative results, so survey outcomes. So for reactions, which are the feelings or the kind of the emotional response you have to the training, we interviewed workers 6 months after their training, and there was an overall positive reaction to their the training program. As you can see from the quotes below, they really enjoyed the structure and materials because it was quite interactive. There were videos and slides, and it wasn't too text heavy. And they thought that the training program was well organized, so it was easy to follow. And very importantly, they really liked the trainers, so they had very good impressions of them, and that obviously helps with learning. Okay, so next slide, please. So the next part of the Kirkpatrick model is learning. So whether or not that kind of cognitive knowledge is there. And we measured this by knowledge tests. So asking participants about technical skills before the training to get a baseline, and then right after the training to see if there's been any effect. And we found that on average, trainees scored 11% higher after the training. So it was a written test, and participants in pre-training scored 65%, and that increased to 76% after the training. And this suggests that there's a greater knowledge of the things that we tested. So we tested knowledge of safety indicators, signs, and warnings. So these are obviously very important in on the construction site and is very promising. Okay, so next slide. And then in the interviews, we kind of probed and asked them more about what technical skills they've learned. Most of the participants talked about PPE and the importance of using that. However, they also talked about the knowledge questions, the content of the knowledge questions. So how important it is to recognize the signs and what the colors mean. And they also talked about just general good occupational health practices. So the importance of carrying things, using the proper posture, and doing kind of preventative actions to prevent injuries. Okay, so next slide, please. So we measured, oh, you can't hear? Can you hear me, Jenna?
I don't know what the issue is because I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes,
okay,
yes.
okay. So we measured the learning of technical skills, and now we, thank you. And now we measured, and now we wanted to measure the learning of non-technical skills. So the communication, teamwork, stress management, and decision-making and situational awareness. So in the interviews, we asked, we wanted to see if workers could describe or directly mention the non-technical skills. So there were lots of indirect mentioning. So they talked about taking care of themselves and their colleagues and how the training helped them become more aware of that. They also talked about safety awareness, indirectly talking about how it's a collective responsibility to make sure that the site is safe. And of course, fortunately, there were also direct mentions, so participants remembered the names of the non-technical skills. Okay, so next slide, please. So the next part of the Kirkpatrick model, or the part that we added to it, is whether or not there was transfer. So whether we needed to adapt any parts of the training to kind of increase the likelihood of transfer on site. And look, unfortunately, it seems like there wasn't really a big need to adapt any of the training. Participants reported that skills could be directly applied, and safety is the same no matter what kind of construction site you're in. So this is quite good because the training actually targeted a wider transfer of skills. So rather than just the construction site they're working on, it can be brought onto different jobs and different contexts. So that's very good. Next slide, please. So next in the Kirkpatrick model, we wanted to look at whether or not this learning transferred onto behaviors. So so unfortunately, when we did a quantitative analysis of pre and post safety compliance, we didn't find any changes in safety compliance. However, when we interviewed interviewed participants, we got a more nuanced picture. So it didn't show in the quantitative surveys, but in the interviews, participants talked about using the right PPE and how important it is that they adopt safety behaviors, and gave specific examples of what safety behaviors there are. So it showed in the qualitative interviews. So next slide. Next, we wanted to look at whether or not there was a change in non-technical skills. And it was quite interesting. So in the survey, we found that participants scored lower in the second follow-up, so several months after training, than they did before the training in situational awareness and decision making. So so we were a bit kind of concerned, because we were wondering, like, why would you score lower if you've had training? But these surveys occurred kind of before and after the coronavirus lockdowns, when many people were not working. So we asked some questions about their employment during lockdown, and we found that about 30% of people did not work 6 months later. So there was no opportunity to really apply the non-technical skills that they learned. So obviously you would expect a decay in results. So that may be one way to explain the decrease. When we looked at the interviews, we asked participants, we wanted to see if participants applied any non-technical skills. And as you can see, we have many examples of them using these non-technical skills and naming them directly. So participants talked about using soft skills like decision-making, not being aware of these soft skills and how important they are previous to training, and talking about taking care of their colleagues, and giving specific examples for, like, in the fatigue and stress management point, participant talked about a colleague who was really angry and upset, but then the participant managed to calm him down and realize the importance of addressing it and sending him home. So that's very good. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, next we want to look at the final, like, top bit of the pyramid, so whether or not these behaviors change into overall results. And in the interviews, workers, they reported an increased awareness of how critical safety behaviors, teamwork, and other things are in relation to their colleagues' behaviors. And it's very heartening, because participants talked about reminding their colleagues to use, for example, PPE, and actually kind of teaching new colleagues about the importance of safety. And that overall leads to, as some participants report, less fatigue and better kind of cohesion as a team. So participants really seem to see the results of their training, which is very fortunate. So next slide. So finally, we want to look at the context in which this training transfer occurs. So whether or not peers and supervisors supported and gave opportunities for participants to enact the training skills. And overall, there was good peer support. Participants talked with their colleagues about what they learned in the training, and that gives chance, and that kind of allows for secondary learning, transfer of knowledge, and that may lead to actual new behaviors adopted by even colleagues who weren't in the training. Supervisors were also quite supportive as well. Supervisors themselves talked about being supportive, and the trainee participants spoke about how they perceive their supervisors to be supportive as well, and giving them opportunities to transfer. Yep, so next slide. And yes, so those are that's the whistle-stop tour of the results. And as you can see, coronavirus kind of had a big effect, but the results are quite promising. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kara. So now I'll take you through the last two outputs of the project. So we have the certification system, We were very ambitious upfront, thinking that we could develop a certification system that could be used all over the European countries or the European Union countries. And then we realized that when you look at the different countries, they're very huge, or there are big differences in the legislation and the certification and the norms and the rules. So we have ended up with something that is a lot less ambitious. So for trainers, they are given a certificate once they have completed the training, that they are now qualified to deliver the training. And for trainees, we've got two different certificates. We have certificates for completion of the training, which essentially means that they have to pass the knowledge test, the before and after test, where Karen just showed us the results of. And also after 6 months, they can obtain a certificate of excellence, and they basically have to fill in a questionnaire, rate themselves on whether they engage in the non-technical skills, and their supervisors will also rate them whether they engage in these skills. And if they agree that they do engage in these skills, 6 months later, they will get a certificate of excellence. In terms of the training guidelines, our last output, we've got the safety training guidelines. They are based on the learning that has been acquired through the completion of other projects. We have developed 4 different types. So on the website for the training guidelines, we've got a section for organizations of us practitioners, trainers, supervisors, and for workers. I'll show you in a second what that looks like. And we've also developed best practice recommendations for safety training and evaluation in the construction industry, particularly for workers most at risk. So this is what the website looks like. I showed you the link before. We've got, as I said, 4 different sections. We've got the US practitioners, supervisors, trainers, and workers. It explains the project on the first page, and then you can click whatever you may be, a worker or a trainer. And now we're looking at trainers, and it essentially gives you an overview of the course organization. So what is the course structured as? What tools are in there? Then there's the training package itself. There's a link to the training package itself where you can see all the contents of the training, both what we developed as face-to-face learning, but also the online materials. Then we have the trainer methodological guide, which is essentially the guide for trainers that explains each exercise in the face-to-face training and how it should be conducted. And then we also include the evaluation. And you saw before how we had the big glorified evaluation with mixed methods and observations and interviews and surveys. We don't recommend organizations do that and training providers do all that. We have boiled it down to focusing on a survey before, after, 3 months and 6 months later, focusing on some core aspects such as safety productivity, safety compliance, non-technical skills, and some training transfer. And for the evaluation guide, we basically are taking evaluators through step by step what they need to do before training, what they need to do during training, immediately after training, 3 months after training, and 6 months after training. And we include the tools and a description of how to use the tools, and also a description of how you can analyze the results. And we take into account that there may be different levels of expertise in different organizations and different training providers. So you can either do simple before and after, just looking at the results. Do they look bigger, do t-tests, or in very advanced statistics using structural equation modeling to understand the outcomes. If we look at the worker sites, that part of the website is focusing on both the technical and the non-technical skills. And you can see at the bottom of the page, they can choose the different 5 different non-technical skills. What we have developed for the workers is pocket information that explains all the different technical and non-technical skills. They can be downloaded and used, or they can be accessed online, of course. So that's what it looks like. So what we would argue are the strengths of our project is that it's evidence-based. We did quite a thorough literature review, both of the grey literature and the scientific literature review. And I don't know whether you noticed it. The literature review of the scientific literature has been published earlier this year in Journal of Occupational Health Psychology. Another strength of the training is that it builds on soft skills to enhance teamwork and leadership, acknowledging that we need to do something about how we work together. It's not just about learning what about how to use PPE. It's very interactive and it's open to both migrant and non-migrant workers because we try to facilitate the collaboration once they're back in the construction site. It's tailored to workers with limited language skills, with low literacy, and it includes a lot of videos, pictures, games, and the face-to-face discussions. And we've tried to kind of facilitate learning by having both the face-to-face learning where trainers can check whether workers learn something, they can learn from each other, but also online training that supports the face-to-face training. So where people struggle with the content, they can go in and get some additional learning. And we have also developed a very thorough evaluation of the extent to which training is transferred and whether it brings any changes in behaviors in the workplace. So last but not least, this is our ESTEEM website where you can find all the wonderful materials. There's a description of the project itself, the research team. There's a link to the entire training, and we have made that publicly available so you don't have to register or anything like that. And what we are finding is that our training partners that did the pilot, they are now starting to use some of the specific exercises, not necessarily the whole training program, but picking out exercises that they can use in other training. So it's quite flexible. It can be delivered as a whole, but also specific elements of it can be used separately. Then there's a link to the ESTEEM evaluation material. There's an overview of the events, the presentations that we've done, the ESTEEM newsletters. Throughout the project, we've been sending out newsletters, so they are listed here. There's an overview of the certification. And I should say that our European project is also all about certification. Those of you who've done research and worked in European projects know it's all about documentation and certification and attendance. So what we'll do after this webinar is that we will also send you a certificate that you have participated in this webinar, because then you work towards our key performance indicators. But we'll send that out later. Then we've got a link to the ESTEEM guidelines, and we've got the link to the safety training resources that I mentioned, the 416 types of documents, where you can see more about what has been done already, what's already out there. Then we have our academic outputs, and for now we have the paper in Journal of Occupational Health Psychology. We are editing a special issue in Safety Science where we will have, hopefully, fingers crossed, a paper coming out based on the focus groups and the interviews, based on the training package, a description of the training package, and a paper on the evaluation framework. And of course, the results that Kara just presented, we are writing that up as a paper as well, and we're hoping to submit that in the next 2 weeks. The members area is no longer relevant because we decided to make everything publicly available. We also have a LinkedIn group where we'll post updates about what's happening, latest publications, events, those kind of things. So drop us an email, or you can see the link at the top if you want to be part of our LinkedIn group. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. So all the videos that we use in the training and related videos to the ESTEEM project are going to be uploaded here. So subscribe to our channel and you can see new and exciting things as they come up. So that was a really quick presentation of the ESTEEM project, and we are happy to take questions now.
Yes, thank you, Karina and Kara. Yes, we have a few questions for you. First one, what was the setting of the pilots? Was it tied to a construction project or was it part of an induction with the employer?
We basically had, we recruited through the training providers in Spain and Italy. So we've got different organizations. So we basically looked through their typical clients. So we have many different organizations, small contractors, large construction companies. So there's a wide variety of different companies that had workers attending the training.
Okay, yes. What was the level of response? Participants in training moving after training. I guess this means how many participated in the project or in the pilots?
So we had 119 signing up for the training. We had 107 completing the training, and as they completed the questionnaire as part of the training, we had 100% response rate. What we found was that, of course, the response rate really dropped. So at time 4, we had a response rate of 57%. And I think, I mean, that's logical because there was lockdown in both Spain and Italy. And I'm sure you've read in the media how strict they were in both Spain and Italy. So even if construction sites, some were still open, many were closed, many were out of a job. When we did our interviews, we did 25 interviews with workers. Many of them had moved to other areas outside the construction industry. Okay. So even with the 57, as Kara said, almost a third of those were no longer in the construction industry, and some of those that were still working weren't even in the construction industry. So I have to say that the response rates in the middle of the pandemic were fairly low, but I still don't think, compared to so many other things, 6 months response rate, 57% isn't necessarily terribly bad, but it does limit the conclusions that we can draw, and that's also why I think the interviews are a good way of triangulating that data, because it does show that they had used the training once they had returned, and they did understand what it was all about, and they really quite liked the training.
Yeah. Did the construction workers come from the same team or different teams?
So that varied as well. So in some cases, organizations sent more than one worker. So in a few cases, it was more than one worker from the same team. But in others, it was very much 1 or 2 workers from the entire organization. So it was a bit of everything, because we were trying to get as much variety as possible to understand how does this work.
Yes, perfect. So then another question, what was the decisive factor for transfer of training?
Sorry, say again.
What was the decisive factor for transfer of training?
That's a good question. We have done some other analyses that we cannot bring here. So one of the decisive factors is training is safety self-efficacy. So those that are confident that they can engage in safety behaviors, they are more likely to engage in training transfer. And of course, what we haven't tested this statistically, but as Kara was also saying, you're more likely to apply your skills and knowledge and translate them into behaviors if you return to a context where supervisors and peers encourage you to use your skills. So those were I think were the most important factors that we have focused on.
Yeah. Who do you think can benefit from the project?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so of course we would hope that migrant workers, construction workers in general would benefit from it. And as I said, we've developed the guidelines so it targets both organizations, OS practitioners, trainers, supervisors, and workers. And I think one of the limitations that I have to admit from our training is that we didn't focus enough on supervisors. We learned during the focus groups that they were really important, but we didn't have the funding to deliver 2 types of training. So therefore we have tried to, we focused on workers and then trying to encourage supervisors to engage. And now we've also developed tools for supervisors to engage with workers. But I think maybe one thing I hadn't realized but came out of the interviews is that we might be able to, because we make the materials publicly available, we might have a positive side effect. Because of course, illegal immigrants, they are not able to access training because they are officially not in the country. But because the materials are publicly available, we have tools for workers as well. Even if they can't do the entire training formally, they can still learn from our materials. So I think that's kind of a positive side effect, that because we've made it online, because it's publicly available, then they have that opportunity.
Yeah. Here's another question. Is it likely to change the safety climate with only one or a few workers participating in the team or site?
It's a really good question. I think what we tried to, I can't remember whether Kara presented it, we looked at safety proactivity, and what we can see in the interviews is that they start taking responsibility. What we found in interviews, and I have to admit I was quite surprised by this because I was a bit more skeptical having reviewed the literature up front. What we did find was that colleagues were really interested, even those that hadn't been on training. It was also supported, let's be honest, by the supervisors saying, you know, now we discuss this in team meetings. We actually found that a lot. And I have to admit, we were probably a bit biased in who we recruited. Because I had expected supervisors to be a lot more cynical and less welcoming on changing safety behaviors, but they all said they were, with very few exceptions, they really said that they were very supportive, and workers also said they were supportive. So I have to admit that's probably, our results are really good, and even for me, they were optimistic upfront, they were surprisingly good. So I think it has happened even when only one or two went back, but it's because the support has been in place from colleagues and from supervisors. And that's probably something that's coming through strongly in our project, but probably not in the real world.
Okay. You already mentioned that you would probably involve the supervisors more if you did this project again, but is there anything else you would do differently if you would were to do this project again?
I think we would, yeah, well, I can see in the audience that there are people that know me, and they also know I do organizational interventions. Okay. So I would want a multi-level approach, not only focusing on workers, focusing on supervisors, focusing on changing the attitude, the health and safety policies in organizations, trying to get the organizational level as well. So making sure that the resources are available. What we could see, and again, I think that is a slight bias, was that when they returned to the workplace, supervisors said to them, do you need some additional PPE? Do you need something? Let me know and I'll get it for you. That's probably not the reality in all organizations. So working at those levels, increasing awareness at all levels, I think is important. And to be honest, I have to say, I know this is being recorded, but in not all our countries did we find from the training providers at the national level, there was a huge focus on migrant workers. So I think maybe raising awareness about the importance of training migrant workers and providing good training to migrant workers, I think that would be another focus. So multi-level is what I would go next.
Okay, yeah. One last question.
Yeah.
How to keep this flame burning?
Oh, we have got all kinds of discussions about that. So yesterday we had a meeting with EUOSHA, the European agency in Bilbao. They're going to send out a news item when it's released, and they're going to incorporate it into their organizations. We are talking to the Labour Inspectorate in Italy, that they will put that on the website. We are talking to the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, them incorporating the training into their portfolio, and also they're now developing a competency framework where they're discussing, can we incorporate this into their competency framework? And we have also committed ourselves to have the online materials live for at least 3 years. In Italy, as I said, they're both providing the training as a full, but they're also using specific exercises. In Italy, in Spain, our training partner is now training all their 220 trainers, and they are incorporating it as part of their training portfolio. So we are trying, of course, we are very passionate about making this come live and have a long-term impact. So we are doing quite a few different things, trying to make it live in the long term.
That sounds good. That is all we have time for today. I want to thank you, Karina and Kara, for an interesting presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully we will meet again in another NIVA event soon.
And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Cecilia.
Yeah, take care and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.